Hello, welcome to Orbiting Jupiter, Chapter 5. I'm going to turn off my phone so it doesn't disturb us. So we, last chapter, learned everything that happened with Joseph's history, with Juniper being born, and unfortunately his girlfriend Maddie passing away when she gave birth to Juniper. Joseph had signed away his parental rights, and kept trying to see his daughter, but no one would really let him. They just said he's too young to be a father. So now we're on chapter 5. And chapter 4 ended with Ernie telling Jack to stop hanging out with Joseph. I mean, they lived together, seriously. Chapter 5. I figured out what Ernie meant a couple of days later in gym class. A Friday, when Coach Switek was gone to some stupid PE conference, and we had a substitute who knew as much about running a gym class as a gerbil would. I knew when Ernie told me we had to roll up the mats at the end of class, and I went to do it with him, and Coach Substitute hollered, "Hey, thanks for doing that without my asking." And I looked at Ernie, and I looked around the gym, and some of the other 8th graders were still shooting baskets, but Joseph had already gone into the locker room. Nick Porter and Brian Boss and Jay Perkins were gone too. Ernie said, "Jack." I dropped my side of the mat. Ernie said, "Don't." But I did. The way into the 8th grade side of the locker room was blocked by stupid 8th graders standing like cows at a gate they can't get through. I ran down the center aisle to the other end of the locker room. Someone was slamming against the lockers and slamming again, and I heard Joseph yell something, and someone else yell something, and then I got to the end of the aisle and turned to the 8th grade side. Jay Perkins was on the floor, bent over and holding his nose because of all the blood coming out of it. He was hollering, but the words were sort of snotty and hard to make out. Past him, Brian Boss and Nick Porter were both holding Joseph and slamming him again and again against the lockers. I figured they'd worn their cups. Beyond them, the stupid 8th graders stood watching as Joseph got slammed again and again. Joseph didn't have much of his shirt left on him, but you could imagine the welts the lockers were leaving on his back. Some blood, too. But that might have been from Jay Perkins. And the look on his face, what do you think? Until he saw me. He couldn't say anything because Nick Porter suddenly had his hand across Joseph's jaw, and he was strangling him and shoving him back into the lockers. But even so, when Joseph saw me, he shook his head. He wanted me out of there. Then Jay Perkins stood up. Someone called out, "Jay, enough!" But I don't think Jay Perkins even heard him. And if he did, he wasn't thinking it was enough. He stood in front of Joseph. He was still hollering, but he was snarling too. He pulled his arm back, and Nick Porter took his hand away from Joseph's face, and Joseph closed his eyes. Everything stopped. The stupid herd of 8th graders, Nick Porter and Brian Boss, Joseph, Jay Perkins with blood on his fist. Everything stopped, and I thought I heard some of the words Joseph cried in his dreams. Words I didn't even know. I think they were coming from me. I pushed off from the lockers, took 3 quick steps, and slammed into Jay Perkins' back. His face plowed into the wire mesh of the lockers, and he fell onto his knees again. And the words were coming out of Jay Perkins' mouth. And he didn't just say them, he screeched them loud enough to be heard in a whole different wing of East Ham Middle. And while he said what he was saying, Brian Boss turned to look at me, and Joseph brought his knee up as hard as he could. It turned out Brian Boss wasn't wearing a cup after all. He threw up all over Jay Perkins, and then he screeched too. And, his right arm now free, Joseph smashed his own fist into Nick Porter's face. Again and again and again. And he was crying, like at night. That's Joseph who was crying. He stopped only when the stupid herd of 8th graders scattered, and Coach Substitute ran in to find out what all the screeching was about. It would have to be Mr. Canton. I sat in his office, still in my gym clothes, with some blood on me, not mine. 2 offices down, Joseph and Brian Boss and Nick Porter and Jay Perkins were in Principal Touchman's office. You could tell that Jay Perkins were there by the smell. You could tell that Jay Perkins was there by the smell, since he had Brian Boss's throw up all over him. But I was in Mr. Canton's office. And Mr. Canton was standing behind his desk, probably so he wouldn't scuff up his shoes. His arms were crossed. "So you want to tell me what a 6th grader was doing in the 8th grade side of the locker room? In an 8th grade fight?" he said. "Winning," I said. "Don't be smart, Jackson. We've talked before about what happens when you're around Joseph Brooks. It was 3 guys on 1. 3 against 1. What was I supposed to do? For starters, go get a teacher." I looked at him. "Would you have left a guy being beat up to go find a teacher?" Mr. Canton looked at me and then sat down. "This is what I meant, Jackson." "Jack." Mr. Canton nodded. Wasn't your fight. This wasn't about you, but look what happened. You might get suspended for fighting. All because you were hanging around Joseph Brooke. I'm telling you, I know his type. Trouble follows him like a yellow dog. I've seen what happens to yellow dogs, I said. It was 3 against 1. Mr. Canton sighed. Yes, it was. I'm not saying you didn't think it was the right thing to do. And I'm not saying it was, and I'm not saying it wasn't. The point is, you're a different kid around Joseph Brooke, and not a better kid. You need to be careful around him. Maybe put some distance between you two. I think it was the right thing, I said. And you still didn't answer my question. Would you have left a guy being beat up to go find a teacher? Mr. Canton sighed again. Go get clean, he said. Bell rings in 10 minutes. I did. Meanwhile, Mr. Canton recalled my parents. The talk I had with Mr. Canton was pretty much the talk I had with my mother and father. I needed to not get pulled into the trouble that followed Joseph, they said. I need to remember that I was in 6th grade and not 8th grade, and I was not the hero who was supposed to be going into rescue him all the time. I need to remember that. Would you have left a guy being beat up to go find a teacher? I asked. My father wiped a hand across his face, and what was left behind was a smile. Really, a smile. Not in a million years, he said. John, said my mother. Well, he asked, said my father. Just be careful, Jack. Be careful. My mom took my hands. Jack, he said, you do understand that Joseph is not your... I know, I said. Mother stood and left me. And then my father sent me out to start the milking. They talked next with Joseph. That night, before he turned out the light, Joseph sat on his desk. He had a few bruises darkening both his sides and some cuts on his back from the wire lockers. And his left cheek was a kind of zombie blue. Jackie, he said. Jack. Yeah, listen, you should have stayed out of it. Maybe, I said. You should have. He jumped off the desk and turned the light out. Against the starlight coming out the window, I saw him turn to watch for Jupiter. But you know what? He said. What? No one's ever had my back before. Except Maddie. Thanks. I got up and stood next to him in the dark. He pointed to Jupiter, lit up, brighter than anything else in the sky. The air was so cold, it was chiming like a struck tuning fork. I was shivering and my feet were freezing, but I guess I was about as happy as I'd ever been. Joseph and Brian Boss and Nick Porter and Jay Perkins all got 4 days of suspension for fighting, the last 4 days before Christmas vacation. The letter Mr. Touchman said that they would be expelled if there were further incidents, and they would have to make up all their missed work since they got back to school in January, including PE periods. Except Joseph didn't have to wait until January to make up all his classes. When I got home the first Monday of Joseph's suspension, Mr. Giolni and Mrs. Holloway were just getting out of a car. You know how strange it is to see teachers at your house? Gross, right? You instantly feel like you have done something you'd rather not have your parents there. They were there for me. They were there for Joseph. So Mrs. Holloway graded papers while Mr. Giolni went over some proofs with Joseph and assigned his homework. And when he was done, Mr. Giolni graded papers while Mrs. Holloway went over poetic scansion, which no one really cares about, and she made me identify stressed and unstressed syllables and name their rhymes with Joseph, even though I was going to have to do it again in class the next day. But she said it would be good preparation, so I should stop fussing, sit down, and get busy. And when she was done and they were getting ready to leave, she left Joseph a bunch of homework for the next day, too. Coach Swiatek then pulled up in his van. Joseph and I went out, and he said, "Show me your barn." And we went into the big barn, and he said, "This'll do. Get the weights in the back of the van." He threw Joseph the keys. So we brought the weights into the big barn, 4 trips, and Joseph said, "Isn't it going to be cold out here?" And Coach Swiatek said, "It's a tough world, kiddo." And that was that. PE for Joseph was lifting weights in the barn for an hour, and me too, since Coach Swiatek said it wouldn't hurt. They came all 4 days of Joseph's suspension, all 4 days, so we wouldn't have to make up those classes in January. At the beginning of Christmas vacation, we saw Brian Boss and Nick Porter and Jay Perkins at the East Ham Library. Not that they were in the library, but we were, since Joseph needed the second volume of Octavian Nothing. It had snowed pretty hard, and the streets were white with packed snow. When we came out, they were driving by, Jay Perkins on his snowmobile with a face that looked like it had been smacked up against a locker, which it had, and Brian Boss behind, and behind Nick Porter on his snowmobile. They drove by slowly, watching. Joseph handed me the second volume of Octavian Nothing, and he stood with his hands at his side, watching back. On the way home, they passed us again on the road. "You're dead, kid," Jay Perkins hollered from his snowmobile. Joseph handed me the second volume of Octavian Nothing again, and we watched them until they turned out of sight. Then he looked at me. "Don't let them get behind you, ever," he said. "I won't," I said, and then he took the book back. It was the last time we went outside for a few days, except when we went out to the small barn for Quintus Sorterius in the big barn to milk and to lift weights. wearing just about everything warm that we owned, including the long underwear. The weather had turned even colder, the kind of cold that froze the inside of your nose as soon as you stepped out of the house. And the sound of your foot in the snow was a crunch, and you half closed your eyes against the freezing. And you held your coat tight against you, since there's still something about coming into a barn full of warm cows, their sweet breath, the scent of the dry hay, and the sounds of their shuffling and snuffling. With the lanterns hissing, it all glows. And like I said, leaning against a warm cow during milking is fine. The cows were always glad to see us, maybe because they had nothing else to do, closed up in the barn for the winter. Dahlia would look around, and sometimes she would wink. Really? And Rosie? Now Rosie mooed whenever she heard Joseph come into the barn. She waved her rump in delight. When he milked, she thought she was giving it just for him. And when he milked, Joseph talked about Madeline. And when we lifted weights, Joseph talked about Madeline. And when we carried bales of hay to Quintus Horterius, Joseph talked about Madeline. At supper, he talked about Madeline. At night, in the dark, before sleep, he talked about Madeline. Madeline. How the first time he danced with Madeline during a snowstorm, how he was going to have to walk 7 miles home and the snow was already darkening the afternoon, but it was warm inside and he was warm inside. Then they touched hands and Madeline laughed and she began to hum. How they held each other and danced to Madeline's humming and she held her eyes closed, but Joseph watched her and he didn't want to close his eyes. He didn't ever want to close his eyes. He didn't want to miss a second. How one wintry day they dueled with long icicles that dripped down from the roof, and how she hit his icicle again and again and chipped it down to a little nub, and how she stabbed him in the chest with her icicle and he fell down like he was dead. And suddenly she got all scared and yelled at him to get up. Don't do that. Get up. And he did. How Madeline liked to watch movies, eating popcorn with cinnamon, but never butter. How Madeline liked to read poetry and how he pretended he did too, but she knew he really didn't. How Madeline wanted to go to MIT someday and become an engineer and travel to places that need her. But she would dig deep wells so no one would ever have to go without fresh water again. How Madeline loved going barefoot. How Madeline's teddy bear was named Bunny Bow, for no reason. How they would be quiet with each other. How holding her hand warmed everything inside of him. How sometimes he still felt her hand. I guess that night at the pond, while my father and mother and I got colder and colder listening to Joseph. I guess that night unfroze him. Hey guys, by the way, if you're writing this in your reading log, we are reading page 91 to 115 today. On Christmas Eve morning, after milking, my father and Joseph and I took a couple of bow saws and an axe, just in case, and headed up the hills to find a tree. Not too far, since we had to drag it back. My father and I usually argued back and forth about which one to take, but we didn't this year. For Joseph, it was the first Christmas tree he had ever had, and when he looked at one and touched its branches and smiled, number 5, sort of, number 5 smile. It didn't seem right to argue. It was a sweet fir that cut easily, and Joseph and I each took a side and we carried it back home and put it in the front room. Like every year, the smell of it meant Christmas. My mother brought the boxes of ornaments down from the attic, and we waited while my father fussed the lights on, and then we opened the boxes. Every ornament a story, the old ones from when my mother was a kid, the handmade ones from my first grade and second grade and third grade, the red glass bulbs my father bought my mother one Christmas, the 12 golden angels, including this year's new one for every year of my life, the glass bluebird with spread wings, the carolers with knitted mufflers, the silver trumpet, the cockeyed teddy bear with his red and white scarf, the tiny sleds packed with tinier toys. When we were almost finished, my mother went into the kitchen and brought back a small box. This one's for you, she said to Joseph, for your first Christmas with us. She handed him the box, another golden angel. Joseph took it out of the tissue paper. He hung it on the tree and pushed it a little with his finger. It turned and glittered in the lights. Jupiter would love this, he said. We milked a little early on Christmas Eve afternoon, since Christmas Eve at night and Easter in the morning are the 2 times my mother is going to have us a new first congregational church, even if the gates of hell stand against us, she says. That meant we ate early and scrubbed long. Joseph, too. Afterwards, she inspected us, especially the zombie blue patch on Joseph's cheek. And when she inspected, she asked Joseph if he ever had been to a congregational church service before. He said he hadn't ever been to any church service before, congregational or not. My mother looked at him. Ever once? She said. He shook his head. Didn't your mother? And immediately she knew she'd gone too far, since Joseph backed up against the wall and looked down. I'm sorry, Joseph. I'm being nosy, and I hate nosy people myself. I'll finish the dishes. You and Jack run upstairs and get ready. There are 2 pressed shirts for you on the banister. And Jack, this year you can't wear your work boots to church. No argument. Nope, don't even try. I didn't wear my work boots. That night was cold and dark when we got to the new First Congregational Church, and the stars were as thick as cream. Inside, the air was pretty thick, too, filled with that sweet waxy smell of candles burning. We were a little late and the pews were mostly filled, so we sat up close to the front where we could pretty much look right into the manger. Past the red and blue plaster figures, a pink baby lay almost naked in the hay, as if anyone would leave a mostly naked new baby in the hay. We sang Hark the Herald Angels Sing, and O Little Town of Bethlehem, and O Come All Ye Faithful, the ones you'd expect, I guess. But Joseph didn't sing, maybe because he never sang or because he didn't know the songs. And then Reverend Ballou got up to tell the story about Joseph and Mary, 2 kids really, not married, who found out that they were going to have a baby. They were in trouble and they knew it, and there was no one to help them, and plenty of people who didn't want to help them. But angels came and told them not to be afraid because God would be with them, and the baby would be special, and Joseph wasn't afraid anymore. And he took care of Mary, and when they had to go to a faraway city and couldn't find a nice place to stay, because like I said, there sure wasn't anyone helping them, Joseph found a place, and that's where they had their baby, and the star that shone over them that night led others to them, and they knew that the baby was special too. And Joseph and Mary loved the child, and when they went back home, they remembered everything that happened, and they treasured it in their hearts. In the pew, Joseph didn't move the whole time, not a muscle. And when the service was over and we had finished Joy to the World, Joseph handed me the hymnal, and I put it in the rack and followed my mother and father out the aisle. But Joseph didn't leave the pew with us. He was staring at the manger, past the red plaster Joseph and the blue plaster Mary, at the mostly naked child in the hay. We waited for him while the church emptied out. And we were just about the last ones to leave. Reverend Ballou took Joseph's hand to shake it, and Joseph said, "How much of the story is true?" Reverend Ballou considered this. "I think it all has to be true, or none of it," he said. "The angels?" said Joseph. "Really?" "Why not?" said Reverend Ballou. "Because bad things happen," said Joseph. "If there were angels, then bad things wouldn't happen." "Maybe angels aren't always meant to stop bad things. So what good are they?" "To be with us when bad things happen." Joseph looked at him. "Then where the hell were they?" he said. I thought Reverend Ballou was going to start bawling. It was the end of our first Christmas Eve service at our new First Congregational Church. On Christmas morning, it was snowing hard again. We milked first, since cows don't celebrate Christmas, and then came in to breakfast of eggs and grapefruit and cherry babka and hot tea. And afterwards, the presents. The usual stuff: wool socks for Joseph and me, and wool shirts, new jeans, new boots, a new Barlow knife for me, a buck knife for Joseph, books. Pretty good, except Joseph got a copy of Walden, which looked about as boring as wool socks. When it was over and we sat back, Joseph was reading the first page of Walden, probably to be polite. My father said, "Joseph, I think there's one more thing." Joseph looked at him. My father pointed to the tree. There was an envelope underneath Joseph's angel. Joseph stood up and looked at it. He opened it slowly. He unfolded the paper. He read it, and then read it again out loud. "Will help," he read. "Help with what?" I said. "We'll call Mrs. Stroud tomorrow morning and see if we can set up a meeting," my mother said, and then I knew. But I think that Joseph knew what they meant right away. He put the paper back into the envelope. He slipped the envelope between the pages of Walden, and no kidding, watching him, I thought he was going to start bawling, just like Reverend Ballou. He walked over to my mother, and she put her arms around him, and he put his arms around her, and he leaned into her the way he did with Rosie. And my father came up behind him, and he put his hand on Joseph's back. Christmas is the season for miracles, you know. Sometimes they come big and loud, I guess, but I've never seen one of those. I think probably most miracles are a lot smaller and sort of still, and so quiet you can almost miss them. I didn't miss this one. When my father put his hand on Joseph's back, Joseph didn't even flinch. So I guess that means that Jack's parents are going to help Joseph see Jupiter. We'll find out more next time. Thanks for watching.